only problem is we can't hear you. There's
Yeah,
no mics.
I didn't hear a word you said, Tyson. I saw your lips moving, but I didn't get the memo that said we were sitting down there tonight. There wasn't a memo. Well, somebody had to know something if they set the tables up and put the chairs there.
Huh. You didn't have anything else to do.
Oh, well, I guess we'll take care of that in the salary part.
No, that's why the council chamber was built the way it is, because when I was on the council in the old building 20 years ago, so I'm probably supposed to be kicked off council because I've been on too long, but we were sitting at tables, and that was one of my suggestions when we built this room, that we have like a semicircle so that it's more adaptable to what we want. And I really personally feel like we should record these meetings, and you can't record them when you're sitting out there, because a lot of things come up and then we have questions. Nobody knows anything. We had a problem with Synergy one time. They came up here, they swore to us when they were going to put in a station over there by the Baptist Village that if the residents were against it, they would back off. Well, guess what? They didn't back off. We had to fight them. And so I don't want that to happen again. I really like recording our meetings. So I will continue to sit here. I'm sorry. I just, that's how I am. I like it up here.
We earn these
I like
spots.
to see the other people, you know. If I'm sitting down there, I can't see everybody. And when I'm having a discussion, I like to see the department heads. I like to see everybody, and I can do that better up here.
This is the council meeting, March 21st, 2007. The first item on the agenda is under finance and business development. Partnership, so a summary regarding the security process. I think Meyer will make a presentation on that. Jim, Jim Parsons. Good evening. Thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm Jim Parsons with the law firm McKeedy, Muthen and Kleekamp, here to discuss the proposed Nyer development, Al Nyer development on the old Showcase, the former Showcase Cinema sites. In the back of the room are some others representing the developer, Dan Rue, Jim Nyer, Kevin Reardon, and sorry, Kurt. I just wanted to go over a little bit. We have proposed or presented a development agreement to the city that's been reviewed, I think, by the administration relative to that, and I think there's been, some of them have been briefed relative to this. We just want to briefly go over this particular proposal with you tonight. If you have other specific questions, please stop us as we move forward relative to this. So we're talking about the project called the Earl Acre Commerce Center. This is the redevelopment of the Nyer site. I think you've actually, the Showcase Cinema site, I think you've had some other presentations specifically about the specifics of this project before. The project, just for informational purposes, is the development of about 136, the creation of a 136-acre industrial park and what was formerly the Showcase Cinema sites plus some adjacent property. We're looking at proposed new capital investment in the city of about estimated from $40 to $57 million. Construction of up to approximately 1.8 million square feet of space for light industrial, office, and or distribution facilities. And the project would generate from 1,200 to 1,700 jobs with an estimated payroll of $70 million. Project does have some challenges, quite frankly. The project, as you know, is Showcase Cinemas since it closed. There's been probably another potential developers who've looked at that. There are some specific challenges for redevelopment of that, and those challenges probably have led to the reason why the site hasn't developed already. It's because it's such a visible location, you think it would have developed already. But in this case, there's some significant road and access improvements that are needed. There needs to be site excavation, and there's a lot of dirt that needs to be moved to get the area ready for development. Stream wetland mitigation. If you're a developer today and dealing with issues of stream and wetland mitigation, oftentimes, not necessarily on this site, but oftentimes the cost of mitigation to get that permit for the streams you might be having to mitigate may be costs more than the value of the property itself. So it's a very expensive proposition relative to that. And storm detention, parking that's required, as well as in this particular site's hampered for the development itself. It's hampered by a gas line that runs through the site that has to be relocated. We're estimating that those costs just to develop this site, the infrastructure costs, not the cost to build the private parts of the development is about $15.5 million. We are looking at development of some assistance from the city and or other governments that could cover some of these particular costs associated with this. And actually these incentives would be pledged to especially the TIF incentive would be pledged specifically to the cost of the infrastructure and site costs. One is the use of industrial revenue bond financing for the financing of the project itself. In Kentucky, and I'll explain a little bit more about industrial revenue bonds, but that would actually provide a property tax relief for the project for the life of the bonds. And that would then provide some incentive to help cover those costs. The other incentive is called tax increment financing. Actually, about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, I actually made a presentation to council just to explain what TIF is, but it's a tool that's been around for a number of years in other states, but Kentucky has been using it pretty actively since about 2007. Tax increment financing is basically a tool that would allow the capture of certain taxes, and those taxes can be utilized as an incentive for the project. I want to go over TIF a little bit, just real briefly. And if you have any specific questions or if anything I'm saying, please stop me. But really, tax increment financing is simply a mechanism where you can capture the new revenues created by development in a specific designated area and then utilize all or a portion of those new taxes to provide incentives for a project. When you create a TIF district, the baseline revenues are called old revenues. Those are the revenues that are generated at the site at the time, basically the calendar year prior to the time the TIF district is created. And we're not talking about a pledge of those revenues. Those revenues would continue, but it's the increment over and above that then can be utilized to support development. And there's a number of projects that use a TIF incentive in Kentucky, in northern Kentucky specific. Ark Encounter is a good example. If anybody has been to the Ark project in Grant County, TIF was one of the incentives utilized to help pay for some of the costs associated with that project. There's some others in Covington, Newport that are moving forward using that specific incentive. The development of the drawbridge Insight right now, we haven't got final approval of that or those agreements at the state level, but that particular project, the primary incentive there is tax increment financing. What does TIF do? TIF actually is not a it doesn't create any tax exemptions. It also doesn't create any restrictions on property, and it doesn't change the way property is taxed or taxes are collected. TIF is simply a way to capture that incremental increase in taxes from a designated area of the city and then to utilize a portion of those taxes to promote the redevelopment of that specific area. IRBs. IRBs is another very commonly used incentive in northern Kentucky. In fact, a number of development projects across the region, and I've identified a few there. Basically, IRBs are really private financing. They're bonds that are issued by the city, and they're actually public bonds, but they are not the debt of the city at all. In that circumstance, IRBs are basically private financing that's structured like a public bond issue, like a public finance issue, and the debt is totally the obligation of the developer and the private project. But the use of that tool creates a property tax relief on that project for the life of the bonds. And projects across the region are very commonly used. The Ascent in Covington, the Buttermilk Town Center, the Newport on the Levee, Newport Aquarium, South Shore condominiums. Just, years ago, the first use of industrial bonds, almost the entire industrial park and it was financed using that particular approach to provide some incentives for those projects. Locally, close to you, Citibank expansion was using IRB as an incentive for that project, as well as FedEx Ground and the Toyota Distribution Center all used IRBs. The important thing about IRBs, and I'll stress it again and again, that the bonds are not the debt of the city. The city is simply the conduit issuer for those bonds, and that the project itself is totally responsible for the payment of those. The proposal that we have given the city, and we would like to hopefully have council approval of that particular development agreement, is that NIRE, they acquire the property, they develop it, they build the project, and they market the project for development. As part of this project moving forward, the city then, one, would issue industrial revenue bonds for the project. And in addition to that, as part of that, because it creates a local property tax exemption, it's very common that you have something called a pilot agreement or a payment in lieu of taxes agreement that goes along with that says basically, notwithstanding the fact that this property is exempt from local property taxation, there's going to be contractual payments made, and they're set forth in the agreement to the city, the school system, and the county for the life of the bond. So even though it's technically exempt, we'll have pilot payments to the city of a certain amount as set forth in the agreement. So it will not be totally exempt for city tax purposes relative to that. And that's very commonly done. I've done a number of projects recently in Covington, a lot of the apartment buildings, even if you're familiar in Covington, there's a Duveneck project under construction right next to Braxton Brewery, the old Sears farm store area and things on Washington Street. Those are being financed with IRBs, and there's a pilot agreement to the city, the county, and the school district to make those projects work. And there's a number of others that have been done that way. I'm sorry, I'm going to back up if I can. Oh, yeah. The other part of this particular offer, the proposal we're having, is that the city creates a TIF district as part of our area as a TIF district, and pledges, because the IRBs deal with the real estate taxes, there's no reason to pledge the real estate taxes through the TIF situation. So we would look at a pledge of the payroll taxes, a portion of the payroll taxes generated by the project, and we're suggesting an 80% of the city's payroll taxes generated from this particular area to be pledged to support those site and infrastructure costs. And in addition to that, the agreement provides that once the site and infrastructure costs and the financing costs are recovered, the TIF incentive ends. So you can keep the TIF agreement in place, and you can keep the pledges of TIF in place, but they will not go to NIRE on that after that point. You can use those for other purposes within the TIF district if you choose to do so, or you could terminate them at that particular time, and then all the revenue would go to the city's general fund. Let me see if I'm going to back up. Yeah, wanted to be sure I think I skipped a slide.
Are you wanting to go back? Or
I'm wanting to go forward now. You can move it forward if you would. Can you move it forward or mine? Okay.
Is this the direction right here?
Okay. Go forward to the NIRE agreement, if you would. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide. I'm sorry. Again, as part of the offer here, NIRE will pay the cost associated with establishing the TIF district. They'll cover all the costs associated with the issuance of the IRBs. In addition, there has been some discussion that when we create this area as a TIF district, at least there's been some interest that the city might want to create a larger TIF district that might incorporate some of the surrounding property that the city then could use, if it chose to do so, to promote incentives for the development of that area surrounding this. And if you're interested in that, NIR's willing to work with you, and we'll cover the costs associated with creating that larger TIF district. That's not uncommon. In fact, when we did the Fort Mitchell project for Drawbridge Inn site, there was a much larger TIF district created than just the Drawbridge site to enable the city, if that project took off, to provide some additional incentives for other development. So that's not something you have to do. We're saying that if you want, we'll just have the TIF district be the NIR site development, but if you want, we're willing to do that additional work to provide that larger district that you would then control completely, and you can make the decisions of how those monies were dealt with. Again, the cost of if the cost of the project, the financing, will be the obligation of NIR. There's no obligation on the city on that behalf. City will have no risk as to the cost of the project. And in addition to that, I want to make it clear that the incentives are really comparable to what other cities are doing in Northern Kentucky. And we gave actually the city staff a pretty detailed report as to what Covington, Newport, Fort Mitchell, and all these communities across the region are doing. So because we didn't want you to feel like you're an outlier, that we're asking more from you than other developments across the region are receiving for projects similar to this. In fact, I recently just created a TIF district in Walton, and it's very similar to the pledges. There's another industrial park that another developer's working on that's similar, very similar to what's happening here. The benefits to the city, of course, is the development of the site, and a site that has definite challenges and has been vacant for a number of years. There's going to be a significant increase in taxes to the city, even with the pledges of incentives that we're talking about. We've given the city staffs, one, you'll have the pilot payments from the real estate taxes. You'll have the 20% of the payroll taxes not pledged to the TIF. You have insurance premium taxes. You'll have some tangible taxes. So there'll be a series of taxes. In fact, we gave a rough estimate of those additional taxes that we believe the project could generate to the city, even over and above the incentives to the city staff, so they've had that and can review. The other side of the coin is these projects often encourage other development. So as this happens, get some excitement generated there, and other things happening, even the employees at these particular places, they spend money, and so they go to lunch, they do other things. And so if you have service and other needs in the area, that will help develop other development around the site. And again, if you want the expanded TIF district, then that would enable you to utilize the incentives there. And I could work with your staff on how that can be done to encourage other development. So there's another benefit to the city, even apart from this specific development. And then, questions, if there are any. I'll be glad to answer questions and talk about how the process works and things like that. Overall, I think you've been pretty impressed with the project itself, and there's some, if you want specific questions about the project and plans and things like that, the folks from NIR are here to answer those, but I was really going to present the development agreement to you as well as the particular incentives requested for the project. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. That's right. What would happen to it is that based upon the development agreement, there's going to be, when we create the TIF district, there'll be another document. And it's actually the pledge agreement. It's called a local participation agreement. That document will indicate specifically, it will kind of match up with the development agreement, but indicate that those revenues will be collected by the city. They'll be set aside in a special fund, and then there will be an agreement with the city as part of that as to how those revenues are dispersed. There's two different ways the revenues can be utilized, all right? One, NIRE can, as they build out the project, will account to the city as to the site and infrastructure costs that are identified in the agreement. So they're basically, so over time, one option would be that as the city receives the money and NIRE then expends money in the categories eligible to be reimbursed, you would simply reimburse those costs over time as they are moved forward. So that's part of the way. It could just be a revenue stream back to NIRE to cover those specific costs that we're talking about, the site and infrastructure development costs set forth in the agreement. If the revenue stream is sufficient and it's an established revenue stream, and this might happen after the project moves forward, you get some stabilization, you get some employment there on site. Another way that can be done to use that is that the costs that are eligible to be paid from the TIF, the city could actually issue what we call increment bonds. And those increment bonds are supported from the TIF revenue stream. And that is another option that could be done. And again, those bonds are not the debt of the city. They're pledged specifically from the increment stream, but then you basically can use the increment bonds as a way to directly pay for that part of the development cost. We're not looking at the TIF increment or the increment bonds to pay any part of what we would call I would maybe identify as the private costs of the development. They're not reimbursing those costs. They're simply reimbursing the site development costs and the infrastructure costs. Now, and part of the implementation here is that NIRE would have to account back to the city so that you're actually getting evidence that they've actually expended these monies or these monies are going for a particular purpose. Yes, sir. Basically, basically NIRE is basically accounting to the city.
Right, but then who is responsible for assuring that those expenses would be qualified expenses for the capital improvement?
We've identified those in the agreement, and so it would have to show up as either the site costs or the infrastructure costs. And we would have to show you that those were the way you would account for any of those costs. We would provide specific information to you and relative to that. So you would have to satisfy, quite frankly, your city finance people and things that these are eligible costs. And that actually can be, that can easily be done on that. Now, we basically could get it to what form you want so that the city is comfortable to be sure that those costs are actually reimbursing the correct costs.
Sorry.
The reimbursement of could go on if we use a traditional reimbursement approach where NIRE handles all the financing, there's no bonds. The reimbursement could technically be 30 years, which is the life of the TIF. Under this particular situation, if the project overperforms, because in addition to that, there's another part of the agreement. It's not just the TIF increment that can count toward that infrastructure cost. The property tax savings that inure to the benefit of the NIRE is also in that calculation too. So even though the property taxes, and I know this gets a little complicated here, but even though the property tax savings are not part of the TIF because we're using IRBs, we do have a provision in the development agreement that the incentives based upon the property taxes that NIRE receives as a benefit, plus the TIF incentive, jointly add up to the reimbursement of those in costs.
Okay, so NIRE develops the property. They incur a lot of expenses.
That's right.
That's all would be up front. Part of it is going to come along later.
That's right.
So when those occupational taxes start accumulating, TIF or NIRE invoices the city.
That's correct.
And do they invoice the city for all of the expenses at once? Or
they may very well account to the city to all the expenses they've expended. The city is only obligated to reimburse NIR with whatever the increment is. So for instance, if we show you we've spent $10 million, but there's only $50,000 that year in increment, then we're only entitled to our percentage of that $50,000. The city is not obligated to cover any costs more than what the increment is. 80% of whatever that increment is. That's correct. And then if we say we're in the end of this a little bit longer, and you have an established revenue stream that you can then go out and maybe finance some of that, it may very well be that, you know, NIR could get paid for a larger piece of that at one time, but it's still, the city's obligation is still only that increment that's generated. The city has no other obligation other than that.
The amount of the TIF is established up front.
That's correct. And the agreement's pretty clear on we've identified specifically the costs we're talking about, and we've actually capped those in the agreement. So, so in this particular situation, we have a cap, we have a financing cost. So those two things are capped in the agreement. And so, so the NIR, say those costs come in a lot higher than that, the agreement limits the city's exposure relative to that.
Once the city's met that amount, say if it's $10 million, say $15 million.
Yeah.
If it's met that $15 million amount in 15 years, the TIF is done.
The TIF is done. Now, there's two things you can do at that point. One, you can end the TIF completely. Or, because especially if we've created the other area, you can then move those revenues from the NIR obligation to another project you want to incentivize in the area. So that's really going to be totally up to the city how you want to deal with that. You may want to keep the TIF in place, but then you may want to use this revenue stream to support other projects that might need to be supported within that development area. But that's totally within your call on that and how council wants to move forward.
And I've seen your spreadsheet, and in all fairness, it's a little complicated here, your spreadsheet and what is your estimated time as to when that $15.5 million will be paid off?
I don't have that. I don't know if it is not in that. So
I'm not stupid that I couldn't.
no, it isn't. So because it really is, because if you look at, and Frank is right on a big thing, on the TIF side, if you look at the TIF revenue stream, the revenues, the first 5 to 10 years, you're going to have not significant TIF increment. The revenue stream, the big revenue stream's on the back end. And so it's really hard. A lot of the issues would determine, one, how long it takes to get the project built, what kind of phasing schedule you'll have. I think the first plan here is to start the development of the site, get it ready for development, and then you may have one building start. So the TIF increment, quite frankly, on this one wouldn't start generating until you actually you might get some TIF increment from the employee payroll taxes generated, but the main TIF increment would only come into play once we get employees on site working full time. So you're probably looking at a TIF increment that kind of builds at the back end relative to that. Now, once we can work with you on estimates as we move forward, that could give you some indication of what some ideas are, but it's really hard. We wouldn't want to be held to that, because it really is hard to estimate that.
Vicki has one
I
too.
have one.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, this is about the construction, and I was concerned with the people who are going to be hired for construction. Do you make any effort at all to try to hire local people, or do you go out of state? Because I know when they built the Wayfair building, I heard that a lot of people were employed, they brought them in from out of state? How does that work?
Nair might be able to answer that, but they are a local development company. It's not like they're an out-of-state development. You know, they're headquartered in Cincinnati, but it's not like it's a way out-of-state area coming in from outside to do this. So I don't know if you want to answer that, or Dan, or anybody, or.
Sure. So yeah, we're a local-based company. So we've been in Cincinnati for 120 years. Our intent is to work with local contractors.
Okay, that's good, because I like to see the local people benefit from this project.
Well, there's another thing that helps, besides the local people on the building side, even the business locations there. You know, when not just the contractors, but the employees who will be in the buildings that are occupied. The way the state incentives work on this, there's really an encouragement there to hire Kentucky residents for those positions. And the reason for that is the state incentive, the KBI incentives and things, are often based upon Kentucky resident income taxes. And if you're living in even Ohio, you're not, you know, it reduces the amount of the incentive because under the KBI incentive, you don't get that. So a lot of companies that will be locating here, even after the project's constructed, will want to put an emphasis for hiring Kentucky residents.
That's good, thanks.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. You had a question?
Yeah, I just want to check my understanding on something. So on slide 2, we're looking at creation of 1,700 jobs.
Yeah.
And it says an estimated payroll of $70 million.
Yeah.
Is that a year, or are you looking at
After the project is fully developed and occupied, yes, it's $70 million a year.
And I know you don't have an exact number, but like, when do you see completion? Like, are we looking, we're not going to get to a $70 million number within 10 years or 5 years, or? Because I'm trying to think about the payroll taxes.
Yeah.
And your 8% coming back to pay $15.5 million bond, right? Is that correct? I'm just trying to understand.
Well, again, the payroll tax, I don't know, Dan or Jim, do you have a better idea of phasing of how long it take to actually build out the full project? It might be, and there, so that we can, when do they anticipate getting the full occupancy?
So the intent is to close the property in the third quarter. And start construction for the first building. So ideally, you know, knock on wood, market stays hot. We like to have full build out within 5 years.
Yeah.
Because then it makes the numbers look, I don't know, I mean, when I look at 70% of 70 million, it's 56 million. And that's paying off the bond relatively quickly.
Well, it's not in the 70 million, it'd be your payroll tax times the 70 million. So it's not, yeah, so it's a percentage of that, so that's right. Yeah, that's right. So it's 1.5%. So it's, if you look at, if there was 70 million in payroll, it would be 1.5% times 70 million times 80% is what would be going to the Nair development. That's right, county and schools going into. In fact, we fully anticipate, in addition to the city increment that would be going to this, we anticipate that Kenton County will participate too. Traditionally, I've done about 4 TIF districts in Kenton County, and every one of those, Kenton County has participated with Covington, Fort Wright, Fort Mitchell, even the Walton TIF district. Kenton County participated. So we're certainly, in addition to the city payroll taxes that would be going into that, a percentage of the county payroll taxes will too.
Could you clarify something?
Yeah.
Or, the 15.5 million that are the capital parts of the project, could you explain to everyone the other components of it so that people don't think 15.5 million is going to build the whole project?
No, that's the site development cost and the road things. Okay, basically the concept of the $15.5 million cost that we're talking about, that's just the site development cost, the road improvements, the stream mitigation cost, those. The other, what I consider in this, the private, if we consider it private cost, the private cost would be the actual building construction. And so the warehouses, the office buildings, anything, that's what I would consider the private cost. And you're looking at, you know, depending upon what ultimately goes there, the cost could go up significantly relative to that. So you're looking at the other potential, you know, 40 plus $40 million in development. That's what I call the private costs. You know, it'd be the actual buildings themselves.
Just to clarify one thing, Mr. Wood. So you said build out, you thought half in 5 years. And do you think that the lease up would be right behind that? Is that what you're?
We hope so. When we originally presented this development plan, it was a 3-building site plan. And due to kind of the challenges of the site, we tweaked that to a 2-building site plan. And that actually helped with the lease up projections for the site. So part of this is getting the right amount of in the right time. So our projection is a fully built out park within 5 years. And we are deliberately designing this to provide more parking. What we're seeing in the market is a need for significantly more parking than a traditional industrial park. And we talked about that in the last presentation. That's holding true. The prospects that we're fielding currently are creating more parking. This tweaking site plan is very relevant. I want to point that out. And when we presented at the first council meeting several months ago, we also provided the UC economic impact study. We always like to present an economic impact study to so that the folks understand what's going on and so critical effects of a project. I think that's relevant. It has been tweaked a little bit with the site plan, but it's roughly the same type of.
Yeah, Dave. From our standpoint, we would hope if we've answered your questions and you're satisfied to move forward, that whenever you can, as soon as possible, you'd move forward to the next step, which would be just to authorize the development agreement. And once that development agreement is authorized and executed, then actually we would be starting working actively with the city to create the TIF district. And that's the next step from our end, would be to establish that. That's a couple-month process to get that in place. There's some procedural things that have to be done. There are some public hearings we'd have to do relative to that, but we would start working with staff. In addition to that, if council decides and mayors and administration decides they want to build this larger TIF district and create that, we would start working with your actively with your staff to identify that. I could give some advice to you on how to better structure that, because there are some things you want to be careful with when you're creating a larger TIF district, so you're not incorporating property in there that's going to be a drag on your TIF. So that's from our standpoint, but the first step from us would be to, if you would, is the approval of the development agreement.
Is that include the development agreement?
There is a physical development agreement that's been leased, a draft of that we've been at least given to the administration so they can review that. So. No, I don't know what, so, hold on, so, I'm sorry.
Let me touch on that.
Sorry.
Before started. We met with Finance Committee has seen the development agreement. We met with them 2 weeks ago, along with Parsons and I, and working with the representatives to do that. We have it here. All of those costs are pretty much laid out in this. We wanted them to come tonight, put on this presentation that explains exactly what TIF finance
It hasn't changed, so.
We have it, David reconfirmed that again, the funding is ready. Send it out, everybody can look at it and see it. Familiar with what that agreement is. And what we would be looking for in our preliminary conversation with Nair, of course, is to have that municipal order read and giving the mayor the authority to sign this agreement at our April council meeting. So that then they can move forward and create this and go on, because I think it gives them some leeway in moving forward to be able to get things done in the place that they have.
And that's very consistent with what normally happens. By having the development agreement in place, the NIR is comfortable moving forward, starting the process for acquisition and things like that, because then they know that if they meet these requirements, the city will then do what it's supposed to do. I'll give you an example of that Walton district that just got done. We had a development agreement first with the city, just like this. And then after that, the city then started the process of creating the TIF district. That was a little bit more complicated because that Walton site's in two counties, and so we had to get Kenton County approval, Boone County approval, and things. Even when we go forward on the TIF, we would anticipate going to the fiscal court for their part of the approval. It's very common that Planning Commission, PDS, has supported TIF for other districts in Kenton County, so we would anticipate that at least on the non-NIR portion of the TIF area, that we would want the PDS to support this also. So there'll be some procedural things to go forward on that.
Just let everybody know, we have had some conversations with the county, references, and the county is in favor of this, and they will participate in this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. There's none. So there's none. Not in a sense like that, because if you're your accounting standpoint, you don't do write-offs per se and things like that. It doesn't even come, public accounting doesn't deal with that. But it is, just call this like a public-private partnership that, but for the city's participation with this development and your contribution, the project wouldn't happen. And so, but you don't have the same concept of write-off or something like that that private entities have. So, yeah.
Question, I just want to make a comment. I do hope to adopt this order at our next meeting. This property in the city, they're vacant for a long time, vacant with an abandoned building on it for a long time. This entry of the city is an eyesore. So the possibility of developing it, I think, is absolutely something we should be encouraged. Although we're giving up some tax revenue to do this, it's not going to develop without that happening. And frankly, that we're going to get 20% of our tax occupation taxes and zero, which is what we're getting now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very informative. Thank you.
I know, it's fun. I'm just like sitting there thinking, I really need to go back and read that. Oh, and she can take my thing. Thank you for doing that. You're being busy tonight. Oh, okay.
I wanna know if they
Is
can.
that a jacket? That is so cute.
It is, yes. It's so comfortable, too.
cute.
Yeah.
So lovely.
I know this really doesn't go with it, but I was cold.
Oh, no, I'm freezing to death in here.
I just needed something around my neck, so.
Somebody said he eats supper at 6 o'clock. We can't hear you, Tyson.
What's that? Are these ours? No, I'm taking, well,
Can we look at them? Okay.
Bang the gavel or something.
Oh, that's funny.
Really? We haven't heard anything all night.